All right, still in Unit 1, we are going to move on to Topic 3. We're still talking about our basic geographic principles. And the past two topics we have talked about how geospatial technologies have affected how we can study geography. And then the last topic we looked at was how, although maps are the best way to present spatial data, how they're all distorted in some way or another. What we're going to talk about today, make my face out of the way, is how climate and weather affect how people live in different regions. So, your essential question for today is how do climate and weather phenomenon affect people living in different regions? So, at the end of this lesson, you should be able to answer that in your own words. The first thing we need to talk about, and I want to show you, is where people are living in the world. So, if you look at this map, you will see that the darker the shade, the more people live there. So you can see that most people in the world, not all, but most, live right here in this like middle banded section. So looking at that, I want you to think about what you think is the primary factor in determining where people live. So there's a reason that this is where most of the population has developed on the globe. So I just want you to think real quick, why do you think that is? I'm going to give you those reasons. The first thing that you need to know is that the Earth's ability to receive and absorb sunlight affects the type of weather and climate a place will have. And the two main factors that attract human habitation are moderate climates and access to water. So, if weather, climate, and access to water are the main factors that contribute to where people live, then you could conclude that these areas probably have a moderate climate and access to water. All right. That's one thing you could probably conclude. Now, you don't know that for sure yet, but you could conclude, knowing this fact right here and looking at this map, you could probably say, okay, most of these people probably live in a moderate climate with access to water. All right. So how does water and climate affect, or why does it affect where people live, and how does it affect where people live? So water. More than 70% of Earth's surface is covered with water. However, only 3% of Earth's water is fresh, so drinkable. The rest is salt water. But most of that is frozen in the North and South Pole. So that leaves 1% of the world's fresh water accessible for human use. So 1% of the Earth's water can be used by humans. Only 1%. So obviously, people are going to gravitate towards that fresh water. That's where they're going to want to live. Climate. Climate is the long-term pattern of weather. So temperature and precipitation, or precipitation is like rain or snow. Those two things are the main determinants of climate. And precipitation is necessary for growing crops, raising livestock, and supplying fresh water to urban communities. So these two things together, the fact that only 1% of the world's fresh water is accessible for human use, and temperature and precipitation, climate, are the two main factors in determining human habitation, so where people live. Now, this is a climate regions map. So you could say that if fresh water and a good climate, a moderate climate, are the two things that are going to determine where people live the most, um, looking at these regions and remembering that world population map, which of these climate zones, or which of the climate zones, it could be multiple, do you think are the most moderate that people would live in? Here's the population map. There's the climate zone map. I'm going to show you one more time. Be looking for the pattern, okay? There's the population map. That's where people live. There is the climate zone map. So if you looked at both of those together side by side, if I go really fast, you can see how the patterns line up. So looking at both of those, we can conclude that most of the world's population can be found in temperate and subtropical climate zones. So most of the world's population, this band right here, is found in temperate climate zones or subtropical climate zones. Now, that does not mean that people don't live here. They obviously do, but most of the world's population can be found in these two climate zones, according to both of these maps. What this means is that climate affects where people live, obviously, but it also affects what people can do. It affects what people can eat and what people can make because it affects what they have access to, right? If people are living here, this is where we live, it affects what you can do, all right? You can't snow ski in Louisiana, right? Because that is not part of the climate, it's not accessible. And so climate can affect all of these things. And you don't really realize that the weather, the climate, has an effect on these populations, but it does. Because, a long time ago, even before, there was air conditioners or heaters, people wanted to live where they could live comfortably. And that's where they ended up settling. And so that's where populations began to grow. And so super important thing that you need to gather from this is that climate affects culture. And the next thing we're going to talk about is in the next topic is how climate could determine the culture or how the culture can actually change the environment as well. So you need to answer that essential question for your summary of how do climate and weather phenomenon affect people living in different regions. Go into detail. Don't just scratch the surface of what we talked about. Really think about how climate affects people living in different regions.